The drive back from his attorney's office along the Boston coast should have been one of the happiest of Arthur's life. He had the windows cracked, the crisp New England autumn air drifting through the car, and a certified cashier's check sitting in the passenger seat next to him. $1,200,000. Arthur had spent the better part of 40 years building his construction empire from nothing, and now he was about to hand a piece of it to his son and daughter-in-law so they could stop renting that cramped apartment in Cambridge and finally have a real home, a neoclassical estate with a yard for the grandchildren he hoped were coming someday, a studio for Julian's architectural drafts, and a kitchen big enough for Sunday dinners. He was 68 years old, but today he felt 30. Julian had no idea he was coming. Arthur wanted to surprise him. He had rehearsed what he would say 100 times on the drive over. He was going to tell his son that his mother, God rest her soul, had always dreamed of this moment, that the wealth he had built wasn't just his, it was hers, too, in every way that mattered. He had a leather folder on the seat with him, containing property brochures and a note from his attorney outlining how the gift would be structured without tax complications. He had thought of everything. Arthur pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex just before noon on a Tuesday. Julian worked from home on Tuesdays, and Arthur knew Elena had the morning off from the high-end art gallery where she managed client relations. He figured he would catch them both together, maybe take them out for lunch afterward and let the news sink in over a good meal. He parked, grabbed the folder, and walked toward their building. Their unit was on the second floor, at the end of the outdoor landing. Arthur was climbing the stairs when he heard her voice coming through the partially open window. His daughter-in-law. She was speaking fast, the way she did when she was calculating or agitated, and he slowed his steps without thinking about it. He doesn't know anything, Mom. He has no idea how much the old man is actually worth. Arthur stopped. He told himself she could be talking about a wealthy client from the gallery, a stranger, anyone else. He stood perfectly still on the wooden landing, the crisp autumn wind suddenly feeling like ice against his neck, and he listened. He hated himself for eavesdropping, yet his feet refused to move. Julian thinks his dad's business is just some small-time local contractor firm, Elena said, her voice dropping to a harsh, pragmatic whisper. He told me that himself. But I looked into the commercial registries, Mom. I found the public filings for the commercial lots he sold last year. It is not a small retirement fund. We are talking about millions. Multiple millions. A brief silence followed, filled only by the distant hum of Cambridge traffic. Arthur gripped the leather folder. The fine grain of the material felt heavy, almost unbearable in his hand. I know, Elena continued, her tone sharp and impatient. I know. But you need to listen to me. He is going to buy us a house. Julian practically begged him for help with the down payment, and Arthur is so desperate to play the perfect father that he will probably buy the whole thing outright. If we can just get him to put the deed in both our names, and he will, Mom, because Julian will insist on it if I play my cards right. Julian is soft. He loves me so much he would give me the blood in his veins. Arthur felt a physical weight pressed down on his chest. It was not anger. It was a cold, hollow grief that paralyzed his lungs. Once my name is on the deed, Elena said, the words slipping out with terrifying ease, we wait. 2 years, maybe 3. Just enough time to make it look like we really tried to build a life. Then we file. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state. If the house is marital property, I walk away with half. Half of a multi-million-dollar estate. Julian will be devastated, sure, but men always bounce back. The point is, we both walk away with real money this time. Something that cannot just vanish when things get boring. Arthur stood frozen. Time seemed to warp, stretching the seconds into an eternity. In the span of perhaps 90 seconds, his entire reality had fractured. 2 devastating truths crystallized in his mind simultaneously. The first truth was that Elena, the woman who remembered his favorite brand of coffee, the woman who bought him thoughtful cashmere scarves for Christmas, was actively plotting to use his unconditional love for his son as a financial weapon. The second truth, and the one that brought a sharp, physical ache to his heart, was that Julian was completely oblivious. His son, a talented architect with a gentle soul, was not a co-conspirator. He was the primary target. Whatever Elena was planning, she was orchestrating it entirely alone, or perhaps with her mother, spinning a web of deceit around a man who looked at her with nothing but absolute devotion. Arthur remembered the day Julian brought her home 3 years ago. He had liked Elena. He truly had. He thought she was elegant and intelligent. During their wedding reception, Arthur had danced with her, raising his glass in front of 200 guests, welcoming her into their small family. He had foolishly believed that after losing his wife, he had gained a daughter. Through the open window, he heard Elena laugh, a short, dismissive sound that sent a chill down his spine. "Do not worry about the old man," she told her mother. "He is too sentimental to see what is happening. Just let me handle Julian." Arthur looked down at his own hands. The hands that had poured concrete, drafted blueprints, and built a small empire from nothing. They were trembling, not from age, but from the sheer force of the betrayal washing over him. The leather folder containing the cashier check and the property brochures felt like a bomb he had almost carried directly into his son's living room. He pictured Julian inside that apartment right now, probably sitting at his drafting table, smiling at Elena whenever she walked past, completely unaware that the foundation of his marriage was rotting from the inside out. Arthur realized that if he knocked on that door right now, if he confronted her with the check still in his hand, the explosion would destroy his son. Elena would cry. She would deny everything. She would manipulate Julian into believing Arthur was a paranoid, controlling old man trying to ruin their happiness. Arthur had no recording. He had no witness. He only had the word of an aging father against the tears of a beautiful, cunning wife. In a battle of raw emotion, Julian would choose the woman he loved. Arthur knew this with absolute certainty. The silence returned to the landing as Elena ended the phone call. Arthur heard the faint sound of her footsteps moving away from the window, deeper into the apartment. Arthur took a slow, deep breath, holding the cold air in his lungs to steady his racing heart. He turned around very deliberately and walked back down the wooden stairs, placing his feet softly so his shoes made absolutely no sound against the timber. He moved with the careful, measured precision of a man navigating a live minefield. When he reached the parking lot, he unlocked his sedan and slipped into the driver's seat. He did not turn the key in the ignition right away. Instead, he sat there in the heavy silence of the enclosed cabin, staring blankly at the brick facade of the apartment building. The leather folder rested like a lead weight on his lap. He opened it one last time, looking down at the cashier check. $1,200,000. It was a fortune meant to build a legacy, meant to provide shelter and security for generations, now revealed as nothing more than bait for a meticulously planned trap. He closed the folder, started the engine, and drove away from Cambridge without looking back. The drive back to his quiet estate took nearly an hour. The vibrant crimson and gold autumn leaves of New England blurred past his windows, looking gray and entirely muted to his eyes. The hollow, freezing ache in his chest remained, a heavy mass that seemed to paralyze his breathing. He thought about his late wife, Eleanor. He remembered the fierce, protective light in her eyes whenever she looked at Julian as a little boy. She had told Arthur once that a parent only has one true job in this world, to make sure their children land safely when they fall. Arthur gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had almost failed her. He had almost pushed their son out of an airplane without a parachute, smiling while he did it. Arthur pulled into the long driveway of his property. He walked inside, letting the profound silence of the empty house wrap around him. He did not bother to turn on the overhead lights. He walked straight into his study, a large room lined with old architectural volumes, rolled-up blueprints, and framed photographs of commercial buildings he had constructed over the decades. He sat down heavily in his leather armchair, placing the folder onto the surface of his heavy oak desk. He stared into the shadows stretching across the room, letting the reality of the situation settle over him. For the first hour, he allowed himself to simply grieve. He grieved for the daughter-in-law he genuinely thought he had gained, for the happy future he had envisioned for his family, and most of all, for the unavoidable, shattering pain that was inevitably coming for his son. But Arthur Sterling was, at his very core, a master builder. He had spent his entire adult life understanding structural integrity, stress points, load-bearing walls, and foundation collapse. When a building foundation was severely compromised by rot or structural failure, he did not just swing a wrecking ball blindly into the living room. Doing so would bring the entire roof crashing down on the heads of anyone still trapped inside. You had to brace the structure first. You had to isolate the rot, reinforce the load, and systematically dismantle the danger before the building collapsed on its own. Julian was living inside a critically compromised structure. Elena was the rot, spreading silently and maliciously through the timber of his life. If Arthur rushed back and told Julian the truth right now, Julian would immediately confront Elena. She was incredibly cunning. She would deny the phone call entirely. She would twist the narrative, shed perfect tears, and manipulate Julian into believing Arthur was a paranoid, controlling old man who wanted to sabotage their marriage out of jealousy. Without concrete, undeniable proof, the situation would dissolve into a chaotic, messy war of words. Julian, completely blinded by his love and trusting nature, would almost certainly side with his wife. The collateral damage would be absolute. Arthur would lose his relationship with his son forever, and Elena would eventually walk away with the money anyway. Arthur needed ironclad proof. He needed paper trails, financial records, and a legal fortress so perfectly designed and impenetrable that Elena could not break it, no matter how hard she tried or what lies she spun. He needed to secure the perimeter completely before he ever sounded the alarm. He thought back to the snippet of the phone call. Elena had spoken with the cold, calculated confidence of someone who had executed this exact maneuver before, or at least someone who had studied the legal playbook thoroughly. She understood equitable distribution laws. She knew precisely how long she needed to wait to make the marriage look legitimate and viable in the eyes of a family court judge. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. This was premeditated theft. The freezing grief in his chest finally began to recede, rapidly replaced by a glacial, calculating resolve. Arthur reached for the brass lamp on his desk and switched it on, bathing the dark room in a warm, steady circle of light. He opened the leather folder, took out the cashier check, and walked over to lock it securely inside his floor safe. That money was no longer a simple gift. It was now a highly vulnerable asset that required maximum protection. He picked up his mobile phone from the desk. There was only one man he trusted implicitly to help him navigate the treacherous, murky waters of family law and hidden agendas. He dialed the private number of Harrison Hayes. The phone rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered the line. Arthur did not bother to exchange any pleasantries. He simply asked for an immediate, completely confidential meeting. The structural integrity of his family was failing, and the engineer was finally ready to go to work. The Wellington Club in Beacon Hill was an institution built on discretion and old wealth. Its walls were paneled in dark mahogany, and the air always carried the faint, rich scent of aged leather and imported cigars. It was the kind of place where fortunes were quietly made and dismantled behind closed doors. Arthur arrived just after 3 in the afternoon. He surrendered his coat to the silent attendant in the foyer and walked directly to the private reading room at the back of the club. Harrison Hayes was already waiting for him. The attorney sat in a high-backed armchair near the unlit fireplace, a crystal glass of amber liquid resting on the small table beside him. Harrison was 65 years old, a man whose silver hair and tailored suits masked a legal mind as ruthless and precise as a scalpel. They had known each other for nearly 2 decades. Harrison had navigated the complex contracts that built Arthur's construction empire, and he was the only man Arthur trusted with the structural integrity of his family. Arthur sat down in the chair opposite Harrison. He did not ask for a drink. He leaned forward, resting his large, calloused hands on his knees, and he spoke. He told Harrison everything. He recounted the drive from the bank, the leather folder on the passenger seat, the exact amount of $1,200,000, and the quiet walk up the wooden stairs of the apartment complex. He repeated the conversation he had heard through the partially open window word for word, forcing himself to speak Elena's calculating phrases aloud without letting his voice tremble. He described the cold, terrifying certainty in his daughter-in-law's voice when she talked about waiting a few years to file for divorce and claim half the estate. Harrison listened with absolute stillness. He did not interrupt. He did not offer useless expressions of sympathy or shock. This was the trait Arthur valued most in his friend. Harrison absorbed the information like a chess grandmaster studying a board where the opponent had just revealed a hidden, deadly trap. When Arthur finally finished speaking, the heavy silence of the private room settled around them. Harrison picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down. He looked directly into Arthur's eyes. He told Arthur that walking away from that door was the smartest decision he had ever made in his life. If Arthur had confronted them with the cashier check in his hand, Harrison explained, the money would have been in the room, creating an immediate, emotional pressure cooker. Elena would have immediately shifted into a defensive posture, playing the victim. She would have accused Arthur of spying, of being overly controlling, and she would have successfully alienated Julian from his father. But because Arthur had walked away, the paper trail remained entirely unchanged. The money was still safely locked away. The deed to any future house remained unsigned. Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, mirroring Arthur's posture. He explained that Elena's specific choice of words was the most alarming part of the entire situation. The way she confidently referenced Massachusetts' equitable distribution laws and marital property indicated that she was not just venting frustration to her mother. She was reciting a strategy. Average citizens did not speak about asset division with such cold, mechanical accuracy unless they had been coached by a legal professional or unless they had personal experience with the process. Arthur felt that familiar, icy tightness grip his chest again. The realization that his son was married to a woman who treated their vows as a calculated financial investment was a poison that was hard to swallow. Harrison outlined the immediate strategy. There would be no overt actions. There would be no sudden changes in the estate planning, not yet. First, they needed total visibility. Harrison promised to quietly hire a private investigator to dig deep into the background of both Elena and her mother. They were going to look for any hidden financial liabilities, previous bankruptcies, outstanding debts, and civil judgments. They were going to pull the records of any previous marriages or legal disputes that Elena might have buried. They needed to understand exactly who they were dealing with before they built the fortress to keep her out. Then, Harrison delivered the hardest directive of the afternoon. He told Arthur that he must go back to Cambridge and act completely normal. He could not cancel plans. He could not avoid their phone calls. He could not let a single trace of suspicion or coldness slip into his voice when he spoke to Elena. If she sensed that Arthur knew about her plan, she would accelerate her timeline. She would manipulate Julian into distancing himself from his father before Arthur could secure the assets. Julian's 35th birthday was coming up on Saturday. They had long-standing plans for a celebratory dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown. Harrison stared at Arthur, his expression grim and unrelenting. He asked Arthur if he could sit across a dinner table from the woman who was plotting to destroy his son, smile at her, toast to her health, and pretend that he was nothing more than a wealthy, affectionate father-in-law. Arthur looked at his hands, the hands that had built foundations designed to withstand hurricanes. He thought about Julian's gentle smile and the blind, trusting way his son looked at the world. He raised his head and looked Harrison squarely in the eye. He told the attorney that he could do it. He would play the role perfectly. The covenant was sealed in the quiet shadows of the reading room. The counteroffensive had officially begun, hidden entirely behind a mask of unconditional family love. Saturday evening arrived with the bitter chill of a deep Boston autumn. Arthur stood in his bedroom, slowly buttoning a crisp white dress shirt. His movements were methodical and deliberate. He tied his silk tie, staring at his own reflection in the mirror above the oak dresser. He was preparing for a performance. He picked up a small wrapped box from the polished wood surface. It contained a vintage silver drafting fountain pen Julian had mentioned in passing nearly 8 months ago. Arthur was the kind of father who wrote those fleeting desires down in a small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket. He wanted his son to have something tangible, something that proved his father listened to him. He slid the small box into his coat pocket, took a deep breath to steady his nerves, and walked out to his car. The high-end steakhouse downtown was a cavernous space filled with dim, golden lighting, the low hum of expensive conversations, and the rich smell of seared meat and red wine. Arthur walked through the heavy brass double doors and immediately spotted them in a semi-private leather booth near the back wall. Julian was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his face lit up with an easy, relaxed joy. Beside him sat Elena. She wore a stunning emerald green dress that perfectly complemented her dark hair. As Arthur approached the table, the stern directive Harrison had given him echoed loudly in his mind. Act completely normal. Arthur forced the muscles in his face to relax into a warm, crinkling smile. He reached the booth and embraced his son tightly, feeling the solid, trusting weight of the boy he had raised. Then he turned to Elena. He leaned in and kissed her softly on the cheek. Her skin felt warm, and her perfume was an expensive, subtle floral scent that expertly masked the cold calculation he now knew lay beneath. She smiled up at him, her eyes bright and welcoming, radiating absolute familial devotion. Arthur sat down across from them, unfolding his heavy linen napkin and placing it over his lap. The next 2 hours were an excruciating exercise in psychological endurance. To any casual observer in the restaurant, they were a picture-perfect affluent family celebrating a milestone together. They ordered expensive cuts of beef and a vintage bottle of Cabernet. Arthur raised his crystal glass to toast his son on his 35th birthday, speaking words of pride and love that were entirely genuine. But beneath the polished surface of the celebration, Arthur was conducting a silent, agonizing autopsy of his daughter-in-law. Every single action Elena took was magnified through the unforgiving lens of the phone call he had heard just 4 days prior. Now that the veil was lifted, Arthur could see the machinery moving behind her eyes. She was the perfect hostess at a table she did not even own. She was attentive to an absolute fault. When Arthur took a sip and his water glass dipped below the halfway mark, she smoothly motioned for the waiter to refill it before Arthur could even realize he was thirsty. When Arthur told a mildly amusing anecdote about a difficult zoning board meeting from his early career, Elena laughed with the exact right pitch of melodic appreciation. She asked intelligent, engaging questions about his retirement hobbies. She played the role of the devoted, admiring daughter-in-law flawlessly. It was a terrifying masterclass in manipulation. Arthur ate his steak, tasting absolutely nothing, while a low, persistent sound buzzed in his head like a radio tuned to dead static. He could not stop hearing her sharp, impatient voice echoing over the elegant clatter of the silverware. "He doesn't know anything, Mom. He has no idea how much the old man is actually worth." The most devastating part of the evening was not Elena and her flawless performance. It was Julian and his reaction to it. Julian looked at his wife with a vulnerability that physically hurt Arthur's chest. Halfway through the main course, Elena reached across the white tablecloth to gently rest her manicured hand over Julian's wrist. Arthur watched his son lean into the touch. Julian looked at her with that profound, undefended softness that only young men deeply in love possess. He was entirely unguarded. He believed the affection was real. He believed the emerald dress, the gentle laughter, and the soft touches were all genuine components of a foundation built on absolute trust. Arthur had to look away. He focused his eyes on the flickering candle at the center of the table, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He realized then the true, catastrophic scale of the disaster heading toward his son. Elena was not just planning to take his money, she was planning to completely bankrupt his faith in human beings. By the time the waiter brought out a slice of dark chocolate cake with a single glowing candle, Arthur had cemented his resolve into something harder than concrete. He sang along with the quiet restaurant patrons. He clapped his hands when Julian blew out the flame and made a wish. He smiled his warm, paternal smile, playing the unsuspecting fool while the predator sat right across from him, entirely unaware that the old man she planned to rob was quietly watching her dig her own grave. The private courier arrived at Arthur's estate just after 9 o'clock on Monday morning. The sky over Boston was a heavy, bruised gray, threatening rain that had not yet fallen. Arthur met the courier at the heavy oak front door, signed for the thick, sealed envelope without a word, and carried it straight into his dimly lit study. He placed the package on the center of his desk, staring at the confidential stamp pressed into the thick brown paper. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and returned to his chair. He took a silver letter opener and sliced the envelope open. Inside was a comprehensive background report compiled by the elite private investigator Harrison Hayes had retained. Pinned to the very top was a small yellow note written in Harrison's precise, angular handwriting. It read simply to call him as soon as Arthur finished reading the contents. Arthur set the note aside and opened the first folder. The preliminary pages detailed the financial history of Elena's mother. The picture painted by the public records was one of absolute, desperate ruin. The mother had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 2 years ago. The documents listed 2 active civil judgments against her from aggressive creditors, along with a staggering amount of unresolved credit card debt. The financial suffocation was severe. This revelation instantly illuminated the frantic, conspiratorial tone Arthur had heard over the phone. The mother was not just a sounding board for her daughter, she was a desperate accomplice waiting for a massive payout to save her from financial drowning. Arthur took a slow sip of his dark coffee and turned to the second folder. This one contained Elena's personal history, and the very first document made the blood in Arthur's veins turn to ice. It was a state-issued marriage certificate dated 5 years ago. Elena had been married before. Arthur vividly remembered the evening Julian first brought Elena to the house for dinner. Julian had smiled so brightly, telling his father how rare it was to find someone so perfectly aligned with him, noting specifically that neither of them carried the heavy baggage of a prior marriage. Elena had sat right there at Arthur's dining table, nodding sweetly, absorbing the lie with perfect grace. She had been lying to Julian since the very first day they met. Arthur turned the page, his hands entirely steady despite the cold fury building in his chest. The marriage had lasted a mere 11 months. Arthur scanned the legal filings, searching for the reason behind the sudden dissolution. He found the answer buried in the financial disclosure forms attached to the final divorce decree. The ex-husband, a man named Robert, had suffered a severe workplace injury and received a substantial personal injury settlement roughly 8 months into his marriage to Elena. In many jurisdictions, personal injury settlements were protected from asset division, but Elena had known exactly how to bypass that protection. The investigator had attached notes explaining the legal maneuver. Elena had convinced her vulnerable, injured husband to deposit his settlement check directly into their joint checking account under the guise of buying a new home together. The very moment those funds were commingled and legally classified as joint marital property, Elena filed for divorce. The court records showed she walked away with exactly half of the settlement. She had stolen the compensation meant for a traumatized man's recovery. Arthur closed the folder. The silence in his study felt suffocating. The woman who had poured his water and laughed at his jokes on Saturday night was not just a greedy opportunist. She was a professional parasite. She had a proven, tested methodology. She targeted men who were trusting and vulnerable, convinced them to merge their most valuable assets into joint property under the romantic guise of building a life together, and then she activated the trap. Julian was not her first victim. He was simply her largest target to date. Arthur picked up his mobile phone and dialed Harrison. The attorney answered on the first ring. "You read it," Harrison said, his voice completely flat. "I read it," Arthur replied, his own voice sounding like grating stone. "She has done this before. She used the exact same playbook on her first husband." "She is highly experienced," Harrison agreed over the line. "She understands exactly how to manipulate the concept of marital property to her advantage." If you had given Julian that cashier check, and if she had convinced him to put her name on the deed of a new house, she would have owned half of your life's work within the hour. She is not improvising, Arthur. This is a deliberate, calculated hunt. Arthur looked at the pile of documents exposing the profound darkness resting at the center of his son's marriage. What is our next step, Harrison? How do we build the wall? We do not just build a wall, Harrison said, his tone shifting into the cold, strategic cadence of a wartime general. We build a vault. I want you in my office tomorrow morning at 8. We are going to draft a structure so tight that she will break her own teeth trying to bite into it. Arthur hung up the phone. He looked out the window at the gray Boston sky. The grief was entirely gone now, replaced by the terrifying, unbreakable resolve of a father preparing to completely annihilate the threat to his only child. The offices of Harrison Hayes occupied the top floor of a glass tower overlooking the cold waters of Boston Harbor. Arthur arrived precisely at 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning. The receptionist, recognizing him immediately, led him straight into the senior partner's expansive corner office. Harrison was already seated behind a massive mahogany desk, surrounded by thick leather-bound volumes of state statutes and several neat stacks of freshly printed documents. The atmosphere in the room was entirely clinical, stripped of all emotion, heavily resembling a war room where generals gathered to finalize a lethal campaign. Arthur sat down in the leather chair opposite the desk. He did not need coffee and he did not want small talk. He looked at the paperwork waiting on the polished wood surface. He told Harrison he was ready to pour the foundation. Harrison adjusted his silver-framed glasses and leaned forward, folding his hands together. He explained that a direct cash transfer was out of the question. Even a house purchased entirely by Arthur but deeded solely to Julian posed a catastrophic risk. Elena was a master of commingling assets. She would find a way to pay for a renovation, or use joint marital funds to cover property taxes, slowly establishing her legal claim to the estate under Massachusetts law. Once the waters were muddied, a judge might easily award her half the value in a divorce settlement. To prevent this, Harrison introduced the architecture of the irrevocable family trust. It was not merely a legal document. It was an impenetrable fortress designed to exist entirely independent of Julian's marriage. Harrison tapped a silver pen against the top page of the thick contract. He detailed the mechanics. Arthur would be the grantor, creating the trust and funding it with the $1,200,000. A neutral, corporate financial institution would act as the primary trustee, managing the assets strictly according to the rules Arthur laid down. Julian would be named as the sole beneficiary. The absolute beauty of the structure, Harrison explained, lay in ownership. When it was time to buy the neoclassical estate in Cambridge, Julian would not buy it. The trust would buy it. The property deed would be registered entirely under the name of the Sterling Family Trust. Julian and Elena would simply be allowed to reside in the home. Because Julian did not technically own the asset, it could never be classified as marital property. In the eyes of the law, the house belonged to a completely separate legal entity. Elena could not claim half of a house that her husband did not legally own. Arthur listened with the deep, quiet satisfaction of a master builder inspecting a perfectly designed set of blueprints. He recognized the genius of the mechanism. It was like pouring high-grade concrete over a grid of reinforced steel rebar. It was unshakable. But Harrison was not finished. He wanted to secure every possible window and door against a parasite they were fighting. He pointed to a specific section buried deep within the paperwork. He called it the spendthrift clause. This provision explicitly stated that the trust assets could never be assigned, anticipated, or seized by any creditor of the beneficiary. Furthermore, Harrison had included a strict bloodline clause. In the event of Julian's passing, the remaining assets would flow exclusively to his direct biological children or back to Arthur. Spouses were explicitly, permanently excluded from the line of succession. Harrison looked up, his expression dead serious. He warned Arthur that Elena was highly educated in these matters. The moment she realized the property was held in a trust, she would attempt to manipulate Julian into dissolving it or withdrawing the cash directly into their joint account. To counter this, Harrison had structured the trust so that the principal could only be accessed for specific, approved reasons like health, education, or maintenance, and only at the total discretion of the corporate trustee. Julian literally would not have the power to hand his wife the money, even if she begged him for it. Arthur picked up the heavy gold pen resting beside the documents. He felt the immense weight of the moment. He was locking his life's work away, placing restrictions on his own son, taking away Julian's total financial freedom. But as he looked at the blank signature lines, he remembered the cold, terrifying voice he had heard on the wooden landing. He remembered the tragic history of Elena's first husband, a man who had trusted her and lost everything. Arthur realized that true protection often looked like restriction. He pressed the nib of the pen to the heavy paper and signed his name. He signed page after page, his handwriting sharp and unwavering. With every stroke of ink, he was erecting a towering, invisible wall of iron around his son. He was stripping Elena of her ammunition, neutralizing her entire predatory agenda before she even realized she was under attack. When the final document was signed and notarized by Harrison's assistant, Arthur placed the pen back on the desk. The trap was fully constructed, loaded, and completely concealed beneath a layer of complex legal jargon. The $1,200,000 was now safely inside the vault. Harrison gathered the documents and placed them securely inside a fresh leather binder. He handed it across the desk to Arthur. It was time, the attorney said quietly. It was time to invite Julian over for a private dinner and hand him the key to the fortress. Arthur took the binder, the leather feeling cool and heavy in his hands, and nodded. The silent war was about to enter its most critical phase. Thursday evening arrived with a quiet stillness over the Sterling estate. Arthur spent the late afternoon in his spacious kitchen preparing a slow-roasted pot roast with root vegetables. It was a recipe Eleanor used to make on special occasions, a dish designed to evoke the deep, comforting warmth of family and safety. He wanted the environment to be perfect. He wanted Julian to feel entirely secure before he handed him a legal document that would inevitably trigger the collapse of his marriage. Julian arrived right at 7 o'clock, his shoulders slightly hunched against the biting Boston cold. He stamped his feet on the welcome mat, shedding his heavy wool coat, and smiled warmly at his father. The house smelled rich and savory. They sat at the large oak dining table, eating and talking comfortably about Julian's recent architectural restoration projects downtown. Julian spoke with profound passion about preserving historic facades, about honoring the original structural integrity of old buildings. Arthur listened intently, finding a bitter irony in his son's dedication to saving decaying structures while remaining completely blind to the rot within his own home. Julian mentioned the cramped Cambridge apartment again, sighing as he described the lack of space for his drafting tables and his wife's growing frustration with the outdated plumbing. He spoke of Elena with a gentle, protective affection, unaware that every tender word he uttered drove another invisible nail into Arthur's heart. Arthur maintained his calm, paternal facade, nodding sympathetically and pouring them both another glass of red wine. He knew the wine would warm Julian's spirits, making the upcoming reveal feel like a pure celebration. When the meal was finished and the plates were cleared, Arthur suggested they move into the study. He walked behind his heavy desk, while Julian took a seat in one of the leather armchairs, looking curious and relaxed. Arthur opened the top drawer and pulled out the thick leather binder Harrison had prepared 2 days prior. He placed it squarely in the center of the desk under the warm glow of the brass reading lamp. Arthur looked at his son, letting a genuine, loving smile touch his eyes. He told Julian that he had been doing a lot of estate planning recently. He explained that after 40 years of building the construction firm from nothing, it was time to start passing the foundation down to the next generation. Arthur kept his voice perfectly steady, projecting the image of a wise, benevolent patriarch securing his family's financial future. He slid the binder across the polished wood. Julian leaned forward and opened the cover. His eyes scanned the first page, recognizing the legal terminology but initially missing the magnitude of what he was reading. Then his gaze dropped to the second page, where the exact funding amount was clearly typed in bold letters. Julian stopped breathing for a moment. He looked up at Arthur, his eyes wide with absolute shock. $1,200,000. He repeated the words in a breathless whisper, as if saying the number aloud might make it vanish. He asked Arthur if this was real, his voice trembling with a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and disbelief. Arthur nodded slowly. He told his son that the money was meant for the neoclassical estate they had been dreaming of, a place with a yard and a proper studio. But Arthur quickly raised a hand, smoothly steering the conversation toward the complex legal architecture Harrison had constructed. He needed to frame the trap perfectly so that Julian would accept it without hesitation. Arthur explained that the gift was not a simple cash transfer. He told Julian that the money was structured inside an irrevocable family trust. He used terms like tax optimization, asset shielding, and generational wealth preservation. He explained that when Julian found the perfect house, he would not buy it directly. The trust would purchase the property in full, and the deed would remain in the name of the trust. Julian would be the sole beneficiary, with absolute rights to live in and enjoy the home for the rest of his life. Arthur watched his son's face meticulously, searching for any sign of hesitation or legal scrutiny. He expected Julian to ask about Elena, to wonder why her name was entirely absent from the ownership documents, to question what would happen to the property if they ever separated. But Julian did not ask a single question about his wife. The thought of marital property, equitable distribution, or legal ownership disputes never even crossed his mind. He was simply a devoted son, profoundly moved by the staggering generosity of his father. Julian stood up from his chair, walked around the heavy desk, and pulled Arthur into a tight, emotional embrace. He thanked his father repeatedly, his voice thick with tears, saying this would completely change their lives. Arthur held his son, patting his back with a heavy hand. He felt a profound surge of relief mixed with a terrifying anticipation. The bait had been successfully taken, and the trap was now fully armed. Julian stepped back, wiping his eyes, a massive, uncontainable smile breaking across his face. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out his mobile phone. He told Arthur he had to call Elena immediately. He said she was going to be absolutely thrilled. Arthur sat back down in his leather chair. He folded his hands perfectly still on the desk, his face a mask of calm, cold anticipation. He looked at his son and told Julian to go ahead and make the call. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He looked at Arthur with eyes shining with unsullied gratitude. He asked if it would be all right to call Elena right then and there. He wanted his father to hear her reaction, to share in the immense joy that this monumental gift was bringing to their young family. Arthur simply nodded, gesturing with an open hand toward the heavy oak desk. He told Julian to put the phone on speaker so they could both enjoy the moment. Julian pressed the device down onto the polished wood surface and tapped the screen. The rhythmic ringing of the phone echoed softly against the leather-bound books lining the walls of the study. Arthur sat perfectly still in his chair, folding his hands together in his lap. The warm yellow light from the brass reading lamp illuminated the thick trust binder sitting between them. The line connected on the third ring. Elena answered with a voice that was perfectly modulated, carrying the melodic, warm tone of a devoted wife anticipating her husband's return. "Hello, darling," she said, the sound filling the quiet room. "Are you having a good time with Arthur?" Julian leaned forward, his face flushed and bright with overwhelming excitement. "Elena, you are not going to believe what is happening right now. You need to sit down." A soft, practiced laugh drifted through the speaker. "I am sitting on the couch right now with a cup of tea." "What is it, Julian? You sound like you just won the lottery." "We practically did," Julian said, his voice rising in volume. "Dad just gave us the money for the house. The big neoclassical estate we were looking at in Cambridge. All of it, Elena. $1,200,000. We can stop renting. We finally have our home." There was a sharp, sudden intake of breath on the other end of the line, For a fleeting fraction of a second, the perfect mask slipped, and Arthur heard the raw, unfiltered sound of pure, victorious greed. It was a sharp gasp of triumph, the sound of a predator finally closing its jaws around the ultimate prize. When Elena spoke again, her voice had jumped an entire octave, vibrating with an intoxicating, frantic thrill. "Julian, oh my God," she cried out, the words tumbling over each other. "Arthur, are you there? Oh, Arthur, you are the most incredible man in the world. I am literally crying right now. This is a dream come true for us. I cannot believe this is happening." Arthur leaned slightly toward the microphone, keeping his expression entirely blank while injecting his voice with a smooth, benevolent warmth. "You both deserve a proper home, Elena. Julian has worked very hard, and I want my family to be secure. We are going to start looking at the active listings tomorrow morning," Elena said, her words rushing out in a euphoric blur. "We can call the luxury realtor first thing. Julian, we need to set up a new joint bank account for the transfer right away so we can make an immediate, aggressive cash offer when we find the right place. The market is so competitive right now." Arthur watched Julian shake his head, a wide, innocent smile still completely dominating his face. "We do not need to do any of that, honey," Julian said cheerfully, entirely missing the desperate urgency in his wife's demand. "Dad and his attorney already set up the entire legal framework. It is absolutely brilliant. We do not have to worry about managing the massive funds or dealing with any complex tax liabilities or joint accounts." The line went entirely silent. It was not a gentle pause. It was a heavy, suffocating dead air. The ambient hiss of the cellular connection seemed to amplify in the quiet study. Arthur could practically hear the intricate machinery of Elena's grand plan grinding to a violent, catastrophic halt. "What do you mean, a legal framework?" Elena finally asked. The melodic warmth had vanished entirely from her tone, replaced by a thin, tight wire of forced curiosity that failed to mask the sudden onset of panic. "It is called an irrevocable family trust," Julian explained, still completely oblivious to the sudden drop in temperature. "Dad put the funds into the Sterling Family Trust. When we find the house we want, the trust will purchase it entirely in cash. We just pick the property, and the corporate trustee handles the entire legal transaction." Another silence followed, longer and significantly heavier than the first. Arthur stared intently at the small black rectangle of the phone. He pictured Elena sitting in their apartment, the color draining from her beautiful face as the reality of the situation crashed down upon her. "The trust will purchase it," Elena repeated slowly. Her voice was now completely flat, hollowed out by sudden dread. "So, whose name exactly goes on the deed of the house, Julian?" "The trust," Julian answered brightly. "The Sterling Family Trust will hold the deed. It is the perfect legal shield. Dad explained that it protects the massive asset from any external liabilities or creditors, and I am named as the sole beneficiary of the living arrangement. We get to live there for the rest of our lives, completely rent-free, without any of the legal burdens of direct ownership." Arthur watched the speakerphone, waiting for the impact to settle. He knew exactly what Elena was calculating in the dark silence of her living room. She was realizing the devastating truth. She could not divorce a corporate entity. She could not force the liquidation of a property owned by a trust. Massachusetts' equitable distribution laws meant absolutely nothing against the fortress Harrison Hayes had constructed. The massive payout she and her mother had been salivating over had just been locked away inside an impenetrable vault, and Julian was holding a key he could not even legally share with her. "Elena?" Julian asked, his brow furrowing slightly at the extended, uncomfortable silence. "Are you still there?" "I am here," she said. Her voice sounded deeply strained, as if she were forcing the words through a tightly constricted throat. "That is just a very complicated arrangement, Julian. I thought we were buying a house together. As a married couple. It feels a little strange and controlling to live in a house we do not actually own together. But we do own it, essentially," Julian reasoned, his naive optimism remaining entirely unshaken. "It is family property. It stays in the bloodline forever. Dad did this strictly to protect us and our future children." "Right. To protect us." The words dripped with a barely concealed venom that Julian completely failed to register, but Arthur heard it with crystal clarity. "Well, it is certainly a massive amount of information to process. I am feeling a little overwhelmed, to be honest. I think I have a sudden, terrible migraine coming on." "Oh, I am so sorry, honey," Julian said, his voice instantly softening with genuine concern. "Take some medication and go lie down in the dark. I will be home soon, and we can talk about all the exciting details." "Yes," Elena said, her tone completely devoid of life. "We will definitely talk about the details when you get home. Goodbye, Julian." "Thank you again, Arthur." "You are very welcome, Elena," Arthur said softly into the microphone. "Sleep well." The call disconnected with a sharp, definitive click. Julian picked up his phone, slipping it back into his tailored trousers with a highly satisfied sigh. He looked at Arthur, completely blind to the ruthless psychological warfare that had just transpired across the digital connection. "She is just overwhelmed by the scale of it," Julian said, offering an apologetic smile to his father. "She gets these terrible migraines when she experiences sudden stress or massive excitement. But she is thrilled, Dad." "I know she is." Arthur nodded slowly, looking at the empty chair across the dim room. He knew Elena was not thrilled. He knew she was currently pacing the floor of their cramped apartment, suffocating on her own rising panic. The parasite had just realized that the host was no longer a viable source of financial nourishment. The desperate, thrashing panic of a starving predator was about to begin, and Arthur was perfectly positioned to watch her tear her own disguise apart. The week following the dinner at the estate unfolded exactly as Arthur and Harrison had anticipated. The sudden, miraculous gift of $1,200,000 should have brought an atmosphere of absolute joy and frantic excitement to Julian and Elena. Instead, a suffocating, toxic tension settled over their cramped Cambridge apartment. Arthur did not need to be in the room to know what was happening. He could hear the heavy toll it was taking on his son through their daily phone conversations. Julian called his father every afternoon, his voice growing progressively more exhausted with each passing day. The initial euphoria had entirely evaporated. Julian explained that the house hunting was turning into a nightmare. They had toured 6 beautiful properties, all well within the budget of the trust, but Elena found a fatal flaw in every single one of them. The kitchens were too small, the neighborhoods were too loud, the foundations looked suspect. She was perpetually irritable, snapping at real estate agents and retreating into long, brooding silences. Her supposed migraine had evolved into a permanent state of cold, defensive hostility. Arthur listened patiently, offering gentle, non-committal words of encouragement. He knew exactly why Elena was stalling. She was buying time. She was frantically searching for a way to break the iron walls of the vault before the money was converted into an unliquidatable physical asset. Confirmation of her desperation arrived on a rainy Wednesday morning. Arthur was sitting in his study reviewing some old blueprints when his phone rang. It was Harrison Hayes. The attorney spoke with the quiet, satisfied tone of a hunter watching his prey walk blindly into a snare. Harrison explained that the elite family law community in Boston was a very small, tightly knit circle. Senior partners frequently shared anonymous anecdotes about aggressive or delusional prospective clients. Earlier that morning, Harrison had received a very interesting phone call from a colleague who specialized in high-asset divorces. A woman matching Elena perfectly in both physical description and aggressive temperament had scheduled an emergency consultation late Monday afternoon. According to Harrison, the woman had been frantic. She presented the colleague with a hypothetical scenario involving an irrevocable family trust, specifically inquiring about Massachusetts' equitable distribution laws and the potential for commingling trust assets to establish marital property rights. She demanded to know if a wife could force the liquidation of a trust-owned property if she contributed her own income to the daily maintenance or minor renovations of the house. The family law attorney had shut her down completely. He informed her that a properly structured trust with a spendthrift provision and a strict bloodline clause was practically impenetrable. He told her that contributing to renovations would not alter the deed or grant her ownership. It would simply be considered a voluntary contribution to a property she was legally renting for free. The colleague noted that upon hearing this legal reality, the woman did not look relieved or mildly disappointed. She looked absolutely furious. She had stormed out of the consultation room without saying another word. Arthur thanked Harrison and ended the call. He looked out the window at the heavy rain washing over the stone patio. Elena had exhausted her legal options. The realization that she was completely trapped, that she would never see a single dime of the sterling fortune, was pushing her into a state of volatile panic. Since she could not manipulate the law, Arthur knew she would now turn her full, destructive attention back to manipulating Julian. The escalation happened 2 days later. Julian arrived at the estate unannounced on Friday evening. He looked terrible. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat hair was disheveled. He slumped into the leather chair in Arthur's study, staring blankly at the floor. He looked like a man who had suddenly lost his gravity. Arthur poured a small glass of bourbon and handed it to his son. He sat behind his desk and waited. Julian took a slow sip and rubbed his temples. He confessed that his marriage felt like it was suddenly tearing apart at the seams. Elena had completely changed her narrative regarding the house. She was no longer complaining about the properties themselves. Instead, she had spent the entire previous night weeping and aggressively attacking the concept of the trust. She spun a masterful, agonizing web of emotional manipulation. She accused Arthur of being a tyrannical, controlling patriarch who refused to view her as a real member of the family. Julian's voice cracked as he recounted the argument. Elena had told him that true marriages were built on absolute financial transparency and shared burdens. She argued that living in a house owned by a corporate entity made her feel like a temporary guest, a concubine rather than a respected wife. She used tears, cold shoulders, and passionate declarations of love to corner him. Finally, she delivered a devastating ultimatum. She told Julian that if he truly loved her, if he truly viewed them as an equal partnership, he would reject the trust entirely. She demanded they refuse the $1,200,000 and continue renting until they could afford a house in their own names. Julian looked up at Arthur, his eyes filled with profound confusion and exhaustion. He told his father he could not understand it. They had no real savings. Rejecting the money meant struggling for another decade. He could not comprehend why the woman who had cried tears of joy on the phone a week ago was now treating the greatest gift of their lives like a radioactive weapon. Arthur looked at his broken son. The cognitive dissonance was tearing Julian apart. He was trying to reconcile the loving, supportive wife he thought he knew with the irrational, demanding stranger Curly pacing their apartment. The illusion of Elena was beginning to fracture violently under the pressure of the unyielding trust. Arthur kept his voice incredibly soft, projecting nothing but unwavering paternal support. He told Julian that money often brought out unexpected anxieties in people, and that he would never force the gift upon them if it caused such severe marital distress. He was perfectly willing to withdraw the offer and let them build their own path. It was a brilliant, calculated countermove. Arthur knew Julian would never actually reject the house. The dream was too close. By remaining completely calm and accommodating, Arthur made the contrast painfully obvious. The father was offering unconditional generosity and understanding, while the wife was offering irrational ultimatums and emotional warfare. The parasite was rapidly consuming its own disguise, and Arthur was preparing to deliver the final blow. Arthur allowed the weekend to pass in absolute silence. He did not call his son, nor did he reach out to Elena. He knew that the confined space of their Cambridge apartment was currently functioning as a psychological pressure cooker. Every hour that ticked by was another hour Elena sped aggressively tearing at the fabric of their marriage, desperately trying to manipulate Julian into rejecting the trust. Arthur hated the pain his son was enduring, but his engineering mind understood the grim necessity of the process. A rotten structure had to groan and buckle under its own weight before you could convince anyone it was truly unsafe. By Monday morning, the storm had reached its peak. Julian called Arthur from his architectural firm, speaking in a voice so thin and frayed it sounded close to breaking. Julian confessed that he had barely slept. Elena had spent Sunday night oscillating between hysterical tears and vicious, cold accusations. She had packed a small overnight bag and threatened to leave him, claiming that his refusal to reject the trust proved he valued his father's money over his wife's dignity. Julian was entirely lost. He asked Arthur if they could simply dissolve the entire legal arrangement to save his marriage. Arthur listened to the quiet desperation in his son's voice. The moment had finally arrived. The parasite had overplayed its hand, pushing the host into a state of absolute emotional exhaustion. Elena was so blinded by her panic over the lost fortune that she was recklessly destroying the very illusion of love she had spent 3 years building. Julian was now standing on the precipice, confused, exhausted, and desperately searching for an explanation that made sense. Arthur kept his tone remarkably calm and entirely steady. He told Julian to leave the office at 5 o'clock and come directly to the estate. He was very specific in his instructions. He told his son to come completely alone, and he explicitly requested that Julian not tell Elena where he was going. Julian, too tired to question the strange gravity in his father's voice, simply agreed. When the call ended, Arthur walked into his study. The gray afternoon light filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. He unlocked his floor safe and pulled out the thick envelope Harrison Hayes had delivered the previous week. He walked over to his heavy oak desk and began to lay out the documents with the methodical, precise care of an executioner preparing his instruments. First, he placed the public bankruptcy filings of Elena's mother. Next to them, he laid out the undeniable, state-issued marriage certificate proving Elena had been a wife before she ever met Julian. Then came the devastating financial disclosure forms from her first divorce, explicitly detailing how she had successfully extracted half of a crippled man's personal injury settlement through the exact same commingling strategy she had planned for the house. Finally, Arthur took a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored stationery and his silver fountain pen. He sat down and wrote out a precise, objective summary of the 90 seconds he had spent standing on the wooden landing outside their apartment. He did not use emotional language. He did not express anger or write down any judgments. He simply recorded the exact words Elena had spoken to her mother regarding the multi-million-dollar estate and the timeline for a divorce. He placed his handwritten statement on the very top of the legal documents and squared the edges of the stack. Julian arrived shortly after 6 o'clock. The Boston evening had already turned dark and bitterly cold. He walked into the house with his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. He looked like a casualty of a war he did not even know he was fighting. Arthur did not offer him a drink. He did not offer any comforting small talk. He led his son straight into the study and motioned for him to sit in the leather chair opposite the desk. Arthur sat down. He looked at Julian for a long, silent moment, feeling the immense, terrifying weight of the responsibility he carried. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. The only job a parent truly has is to make sure their children land safely. Arthur folded his hands on the desk. He spoke in a voice that was incredibly gentle, yet anchored by an immovable strength. He told Julian that he loved him more than anything else in the world, and that because of that love, he could no longer allow him to walk blindly through a minefield. He explained that a foundation built on deliberate lies would always inevitably collapse, no matter how much love you poured into the cracks. Julian looked back at him, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He did not understand what his father was talking about. He asked Arthur what was wrong. Arthur did not answer the question with words. He reached forward and pushed the neat stack of documents across the polished wood surface. The papers stopped directly in front of Julian, resting under the warm circle of light from the brass reading lamp. Arthur told his son that everything he needed to know about why his wife was tearing their marriage apart over an irrevocable family trust was sitting right there on the desk. He told Julian to read the handwritten note first, and then look at the public records underneath it. Arthur leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together, and braced himself for the explosion. Julian reached out with a hesitant hand. His fingers brushed against the thick, textured paper of Arthur's personal stationery. The study was so quiet that the faint rustle of the paper sounded like a crack of thunder. Julian looked down at the precise, angular handwriting of his father. He read the words once. Then he read them a second time. His eyes moved slowly across the page, absorbing the cold, calculated phrases Elena had spoken through the open window. He looked up, a tight, uncomfortable smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a man desperately trying to reject a reality that was already solidifying around him. He told his father there had to be a misunderstanding. He suggested that Elena was perhaps exaggerating to her mother, or that Arthur had simply misheard the context of the conversation. It was a defense mechanism, a reflexive attempt to shield the woman he loved from the devastating accusation written on the page. Arthur did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply pointed a single finger at the remaining stack of documents resting under the warm light of the brass lamp. He told Julian to keep reading. Julian set the handwritten note aside and picked up the first official folder. He opened it, revealing the state-issued marriage certificate. The heavy seal of the Commonwealth sat stamped at the bottom. Julian stared at the names printed in stark black ink. Elena Vance and Robert Miller. The date of the marriage was exactly 5 years ago. Arthur watched his son from across the desk. He saw the exact moment the foundation of Julian's world cracked. All the color drained from Julian's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His jaw slackened. The uncomfortable, defensive smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Julian had believed he was Elena's first true love, her first husband, the only man she had ever committed her life to. That entire history, the beautiful narrative they had built together, was instantly reduced to a grotesque fabrication. Julian's hands began to tremble violently. He turned the page. He saw the bankruptcy filings of Elena's mother. He saw the staggering amount of debt, the civil judgments, the financial desperation that provided the perfect, ruthless motive for everything she had done. Then he reached the final document. It was the divorce decree from the prior marriage, complete with the financial disclosure forms. Julian was an intelligent man. He was an architect accustomed to reading complex structural reports and finding the hidden flaws in old buildings. It did not take him long to decipher the legal jargon. He saw the personal injury settlement. He saw the joint checking account. He saw the final division of assets, where Elena walked away with exactly half of the money meant for a crippled man's recovery. The study remained locked in a suffocating silence. Julian dropped the folder onto the desk. He did not shout. He did not cry. He simply stared at the polished wood surface, looking like a man who had just survived a massive car crash and was only now realizing the extent of his fatal injuries. He looked up at his father. His voice was a hollow, empty rasp. He asked Arthur how long he had known about all of this. Arthur answered truthfully. He said he had heard the conversation on the staircase almost 3 weeks ago, on the day he originally intended to surprise them with the cashier check. Julian absorbed this information. A brief flash of betrayal flickered in his eyes. He asked his father why he had sat across from them at the birthday dinner, smiling and toasting, while knowing the woman next to him was a predator. He asked why Arthur had let him continue living in a lie for nearly a month. Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He looked deeply into his son's shattered eyes. He explained that if he had come to Julian 3 weeks ago with nothing but a story about a phone call, Julian would never have believed him. Elena would have cried, denied everything, and manipulated Julian into cutting his father out of his life. Arthur said he needed undeniable, physical proof. More importantly, Arthur explained, he needed the trust. He needed to present Elena with a scenario where she could not access the money. Her reaction to the trust was the final, undeniable proof of her true intentions. Julian closed his eyes. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The puzzle pieces were rapidly snapping together, forming a horrifyingly clear picture. The sudden migraine on the night of the announcement. The relentless criticism of every beautiful house they toured. The vicious arguments. The emotional ultimatums. She was not overwhelmed by the gift. She was enraged by the lock on the vault. She was punishing Julian because he could not hand her the key to the estate. Every tender touch, every loving word, every late-night conversation they had shared over the past 3 years was suddenly corrupted. Julian realized that he had never actually known the woman he slept next to every night. He was in love with a carefully constructed mask, a brilliant illusion designed specifically to extract his father's wealth. Julian buried his face in his hands. A dry, ragged sob tore free from his throat. It was the sound of total, absolute heartbreak. Arthur stood up from his chair. He walked around the heavy oak desk and stood beside his son. He placed a strong, heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, gripping him tightly. He did not offer any empty platitudes about time healing all wounds. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable pillar of strength, letting his son weep over the ruins of his completely demolished life. The surgical extraction of the parasite was agonizing, but the poison was finally out in the open. Julian sat in the leather armchair for nearly an hour. The heavy silence of the study was broken only by the occasional, ragged sound of his breathing. Arthur remained standing nearby, a silent sentinel, allowing his son the necessary time to process the absolute devastation of his reality. When Julian finally lifted his head, the profound sadness in his eyes had hardened into something cold and sharp. It was the sudden, necessary clarity of a man who realized he was trapped in a burning building and finally understood exactly who had set the fire. He stood up, his movements stiff but deliberate. He reached across the desk and carefully gathered the stack of documents. The marriage certificate, the bankruptcy filings, the divorce decree, and Arthur's handwritten note. He squared the edges of the papers and placed them neatly into the leather binder. He did not say a word about forgiveness or understanding. He looked at his father, his jaw set with a rigid determination that Arthur immediately recognized. It was the same unyielding expression Arthur wore when a structural negotiation turned hostile. Julian was preparing for war. He thanked his father softly, his voice devoid of any emotion, and walked out of the study. The drive back to the Cambridge apartment was a blur of rain-slicked streets and glowing traffic lights. Julian gripped the steering wheel, his mind operating with a terrifying, mechanical precision. For 3 years, Elena had managed his emotions, pulling the strings of his affection and his insecurities to direct his actions. That control was now entirely gone. The illusion of the ego, the perfect mask of the devoted wife, had been completely stripped away, leaving only the calculating parasite beneath. He unlocked the door to their apartment just after 9 o'clock. The living room was dimly lit. Elena was sitting on the sofa, her legs curled underneath her, watching television with an expression of manufactured, distant sadness. She was playing the role of the neglected, misunderstood wife, waiting for Julian to return and apologize for the turmoil the trust had caused. When Julian walked in, she looked up, expecting the usual look of exhausted contrition. Instead, she saw a man she did not recognize. Julian's face was a mask of cold stone. He did not take off his wet coat. He walked directly to the low coffee table in front of her and dropped the heavy leather binder onto the glass surface. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet room. Elena flinched slightly. She looked from the binder to Julian's face, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing her eyes. She asked him what was in the folder. Julian did not sit down. He stood over her, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small space. He told her to open it. She reached out slowly, her perfectly manicured fingers undoing the leather clasp. She flipped open the cover. The very first document staring back at her was the state-issued marriage certificate bearing her name and the name of Robert Miller. The reaction was instantaneous. All the color rushed out of Elena's face. Her eyes widened in absolute shock, and a sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. The perfect, carefully constructed facade shattered completely. In that singular moment, Julian saw her true face. He saw the cornered, desperate panic of a predator that had suddenly become the prey. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, her mind racing to construct a new lie, a new narrative to explain away the undeniable proof resting on her lap. She opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps claim it was a youthful mistake she was too ashamed to admit, but Julian cut her off before she could form a single word. He told her he knew everything. He kept his voice completely flat, completely devoid of the anger she might have expected and known how to manipulate. He listed the facts with the clinical detachment of an auditor. He mentioned the Chapter 7 bankruptcy of her mother. He mentioned the personal injury settlement she had extracted from Robert Miller. Finally, he quoted the exact words she had spoken to her mother through the open window 3 weeks prior regarding the timeline for equitable distribution. Elena sat frozen. She realized instantly that tears would not work. The documents were absolute. The timeline was perfect. The manipulation regarding the trust suddenly made total, horrifying sense to the man standing above her. She had no leverage left. She could not weaponize his love, because she had just completely destroyed it. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely different. It was sharp, cold, and entirely pragmatic. The voice of a businesswoman recognizing a failed negotiation. She asked him what he wanted to do. Julian looked at the woman he had promised to spend his life with, feeling nothing but a profound, cold emptiness. He told her he wanted her out. He instructed her to pack whatever she needed for the next few days and leave the apartment immediately. He told her they would communicate strictly through legal representation moving forward. Elena did not argue. She recognized the immovable reality of her situation. She stood up, her movements quick and efficient, entirely lacking any display of heartbreak or remorse. She walked into the bedroom and began filling a suitcase. Julian stood in the living room, listening to the sound of zippers and hangers, watching the complete collapse of his marriage with the terrifying calm of a man standing safely outside a falling building. The drive back to the apartment in Cambridge took exactly 42 minutes. For Julian, it felt like an eternity suspended in freezing water. The relentless Boston rain lashed against his windshield, distorting the glowing streetlights into blurred streaks of yellow and red. He kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his mind operating with a terrifying new clarity. Every memory he had of Elena over the past 3 years was rapidly replaying in his head, but this time, the filter of absolute love had been brutally stripped away. He saw the calculated pauses in her stories. He recognized the strategic isolation tactics she had used to subtly distance him from his friends. He understood now why she had been so remarkably patient with his modest income, knowing all along that his father possessed a multi-million-dollar fortune. She had been playing a long, meticulous game of chess, and Julian had been nothing more than an oblivious pawn. He parked his car in the damp lot of their building. He sat there for a few minutes, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof. He looked at the thick leather binder resting on the passenger seat. It contained the absolute destruction of his reality, but it also contained his salvation. He remembered the heavy, steady hand of his father on his shoulder in the study. Arthur had not yelled. Arthur had not panicked. Arthur had simply built a fortress and let the enemy break herself against it. Julian took a deep breath, absorbing that quiet, unyielding strength. He grabbed the binder, stepped out into the freezing downpour, and walked toward the stairs. When Julian unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the apartment felt suffocatingly small. The living room was dimly lit by a single floor lamp. Elena was curled up on the edge of the sofa, wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket. A half-empty glass of red wine sat on the coffee table. She had meticulously set the stage for an evening of emotional warfare. She looked up as the door clicked shut, her face arranged into a perfect mask of wounded pride and fragile sadness. She expected him to walk over, drop his wet coat, and immediately start apologizing for his father's controlling behavior. She expected the argument to continue exactly where they had left off the morning before. Julian did not take off his coat. He did not say a word. He walked slowly across the room, the water from his shoes leaving dark prints on the hardwood floor. He stopped directly in front of the coffee table. He looked down at the woman he had promised to love for the rest of his life, searching her beautiful face for any trace of genuine humanity. He found nothing but a polished, hollow shell. He raised the leather binder and dropped it squarely onto the glass surface of the table. The sharp, heavy thud echoed loudly in the quiet room. Elena jumped slightly, her eyes darting from the binder to Julian's face. A brief flicker of genuine uncertainty broke through her carefully crafted expression. She asked him what he was doing and what was inside the folder. Her voice carried a delicate, trembling tone, still playing the role of the victimized wife. Julian kept his voice completely flat. He did not yell, and he did not show any anger. He simply told her to open it and read the first page. She reached out from beneath the blanket. Her perfectly manicured fingers unfastened the brass clasp of the binder. She flipped the heavy leather cover open. The very first document staring back at her under the dim light was the state-issued marriage certificate. Elena Vance and Robert Miller. The physical transformation was instantaneous and terrifying to witness. The color drained entirely from Elena's face, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent white. Her breathing stopped abruptly. The mask of the wounded wife shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Julian saw the raw, unfiltered panic of a cornered predator flooding into her eyes. She stared at the paper, her mind desperately racing to construct a plausible lie, a new narrative to explain away the undeniable legal proof resting in front of her. She looked up at him, her chest beginning to heave. She opened her mouth, her voice cracking as she tried to form a sentence. She started to say that it was a mistake from a long time ago, a brief moment of youthful stupidity that she had been too deeply ashamed to share with him. Julian cut her off immediately. He used the exact same cold, clinical tone his father would use in a failing business negotiation. He told her not to insult his intelligence. He instructed her to turn the page. Elena's hands shook violently as she flipped to the next document. She saw her mother's bankruptcy filings. She saw the crushing lists of active civil judgments and overwhelming debt. Then, she saw the final divorce decree from Robert Miller, complete with the financial disclosure forms detailing the personal injury settlement she had systematically extracted. Finally, she saw the handwritten note from Arthur, documenting the exact words she had spoken through the open window 3 weeks ago. She read the words she had spoken to her mother. The mention of the multi-million-dollar estate. The precise timeline for filing for divorce. The casual, ruthless dismissal of Julian's feelings. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Elena did not try to cry. She realized instantly that tears were a currency that held absolutely no value in this room anymore. The documents were ironclad. The timeline of her sudden hatred for the trust suddenly made perfect, horrific sense to the man standing above her. Her entire grand strategy had been dismantled and laid bare on the coffee table. When she finally spoke, the delicate, trembling tone was gone. Her voice was sharp, cold, and entirely pragmatic. It was the voice of a professional parasite acknowledging that the host had successfully purged her. She looked up at Julian and asked him what he wanted her to do now. Julian looked down at her, feeling a profound, echoing emptiness where his heart used to be. He told her he wanted her out of the apartment immediately. He instructed her to pack whatever she needed for the next few days and leave the keys on the kitchen counter. He made it clear that any future communication between them would be handled exclusively through their respective legal representatives. Elena did not argue. She did not beg for a second chance or try to explain her motives. She simply nodded once, accepting the undeniable reality of her defeat. She stood up from the sofa, leaving the cashmere blanket behind, and walked into their bedroom. Julian stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, listening to the cold, mechanical sounds of zippers and rustling fabric as she packed her bags. He was standing in the ruins of his own life, but for the first time in 3 years, he was finally standing on solid ground. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, the sound echoing sharply through the confined space of the Cambridge apartment. Julian stood entirely still in the center of the living room for a very long time. He listened to the rhythmic, fading sound of Elena walking down the exterior staircase, her rolling suitcase thumping softly against the wet wooden treads. When the sound completely disappeared into the rainy Boston night, the silence that rushed in to fill the apartment was deafening. The lingering scent of her expensive floral perfume hung in the air, a final, suffocating ghost of the massive illusion he had inhabited for the past 3 years. Julian walked slowly to the front door and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. It was a simple, mechanical motion, but it felt remarkably like sealing the heavy steel door of a vault. He did not sleep. He did not even attempt to lie down in the bed they had shared. Instead, Julian moved through the small rooms with a cold, methodical efficiency, operating entirely on adrenaline and the raw shock of survival. He gathered every scattered trace of her presence. A stray makeup brush resting on the bathroom vanity, a silk scarf draped carelessly over a dining chair, a stack of glossy art gallery magazines sitting on the coffee table. He threw them all into heavy black plastic trash bags without a single ounce of hesitation. He was stripping away the rot, tearing down the contaminated drywall of his life. By the time the relentless rain finally stopped and the sky over the city began to transition into a pale, bruised purple, the apartment was entirely purged of Elena Vance. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, Julian sat down at his small kitchen table. He picked up his mobile phone and dialed his father's private number. Arthur answered on the second ring. His voice was wide awake, carrying the steady, resonant timbre of a man who had also spent the entire night keeping a silent, solitary vigil. Julian looked at the empty chair across from him. He spoke into the receiver, his voice rough and exhausted. He told Arthur that she was gone. Arthur did not ask for any chaotic details or demand a recounting of the confrontation. He simply let out a slow, heavy breath over the line. Julian gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles turning white. He asked his father a question that had been haunting him since the moment he closed the leather binder. He asked if Arthur had meant it. The trust, the money, the house. All of it. Arthur responded without a single second of hesitation. He said of course he meant it. Julian asked if he meant it even now, his voice cracking slightly under the immense weight of the betrayal. He asked if the gift remained even with the marriage completely destroyed. Arthur told him especially now. His tone radiated a fierce, immovable protective strength. He told Julian that the money was for him. It had always been for him. It was meant to secure his future, and it had absolutely nothing to do with her. Julian closed his eyes, feeling a sudden, burning tightness in his throat. The unconditional, solid reality of his father's love stood in blinding, absolute contrast to the transactional nightmare he had just narrowly escaped. He looked out the small kitchen window at the rising sun and whispered into the quiet room that he kept thinking about his mother. Arthur replied softly that he did, too. Julian said that Eleanor would have known. He said she would have seen through the mask from the very beginning, that she always knew people perfectly. Arthur made a sound that was almost a laugh, a dry, melancholic exhalation. He admitted that Eleanor was significantly smarter than both of them combined. He then asked his son what he wanted to do next. Julian admitted that he did not know, the total truth of the statement settling heavily over him. Arthur said he did not know either. But he promised Julian that he would figure it out, and Arthur swore he would be right there, standing behind him either way. That quiet, unyielding reassurance was the exact structural support Julian desperately needed. The emotional paralysis began to recede, rapidly replaced by a cold, forward momentum. Later that same morning, Julian did not go into the architectural firm. Instead, he called the office of Harrison Hayes. The senior attorney did not sound entirely surprised to hear his voice. Harrison listened briefly, then immediately provided Julian with the private contact information of a highly aggressive colleague in family law, a man who specialized exclusively in dismantling fraudulent marriages and protecting targeted assets. Julian wrote the number down on a clean sheet of paper. He scheduled an emergency appointment for that very afternoon. He gathered the thick leather binder containing the undeniable, devastating proof of Elena's parasitic history and placed it carefully into his briefcase. He was no longer a confused, grieving husband desperately trying to save a failing union. He was an architect surveying a condemned building, preparing to oversee its complete and total demolition. The pain of the betrayal was still present, a dull, throbbing ache radiating deep in his chest, but the debilitating confusion was entirely gone. Julian was standing in the absolute ruins of his life, but the morning light was incredibly clear, and the ground beneath his feet belonged entirely to him. There is a profound human impulse, when recounting a story like this, to tie everything together with a perfectly neat resolution. To tell the listener that Julian finalized his divorce in a matter of days and immediately found someone wonderful, or that Elena experienced a sudden, miraculous moral awakening and offered genuine apologies. But real life does not operate like a cinematic script. The extraction of a parasite is a slow, methodical, and often painful process. What is certain is that Harrison Hayes and his family law colleague completely dismantled the legal standing of Elena Vance. The irrevocable family trust remained entirely intact, completely immune to her desperate legal maneuvers and aggressive ultimatums. The divorce proceedings were cold, clinical, and devastatingly short. Elena walked away with absolutely nothing from the Sterling estate, her grand illusion entirely shattered against a wall of ironclad legal documentation. The neoclassical house in Cambridge was purchased quietly in late November. The title is firmly held by the trust. Julian lives there now, designing his architectural restorations in the spacious studio. He is healing, slowly but surely, learning to rebuild his trust in the world piece by piece. On a quiet Friday evening, Arthur sat alone on the covered back porch of his estate. He poured himself a single measure of Kentucky bourbon. The sky over Boston was transitioning into a deep, bruised purple, painting the horizon in colors so vivid they looked almost unreal. The cold autumn wind moved through the bare branches of the oak trees, but Arthur did not feel the chill. He thought about his 40 years of grueling work. He thought about the leather folder that had sat on his passenger seat, and the agonizing 90 seconds he had spent standing frozen on a wooden landing. He had been asked by Harrison if he felt any guilt regarding the manipulation, if he felt he had played a cruel game with his son's marriage. Arthur had considered the question deeply. But sitting on his porch, holding the warm crystal glass, he knew the absolute truth. He did not choose to hear what he heard. He did not use the information to humiliate anyone publicly. He simply took the truth to a lawyer, verified it against the public record, and built a shield to protect his child. His late wife Eleanor had always said that the only true job a parent ever has is to make sure their children land safely. Arthur took a slow sip of his bourbon, watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon. He knew Julian had endured a terrible fall, but as Arthur looked out over the quiet estate, he felt a profound, unwavering peace. His son was standing on solid ground, a foundation that could never be stolen away, and Arthur knew he was going to land just fine. This story leaves us with a profound reflection on the true meaning of family, love, and protection. It teaches us that true love is never built on manipulation, hidden agendas, or financial greed. A genuine relationship thrives on transparency and mutual respect, not on calculated illusions. It also highlights the quiet, unyielding strength of a parent's love. Sometimes, the most powerful way to protect the people we love is not through loud confrontations, but through calm, rational preparation and undeniable truth. Arthur showed us that true wisdom lies in stepping back, analyzing the situation, and building a secure foundation so that our loved ones can survive the storm. If you found this story compelling and valuable, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel to hear more captivating, highly emotional stories every single day. We work hard to bring you narratives that touch the soul. How do you feel about Arthur and his silent, brilliant strategy? Have you ever encountered a situation in real life where someone wore a perfect mask to hide their true intentions? Please leave a comment below. We want to read your thoughts, listen to your personal experiences, and connect with the feelings deep inside your heart. We wish everyone watching this video a life filled with good health, daily joy, and absolute peace. Take care of yourselves and the people who truly matter to you. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.